Well, this is the spot for our new shed. As you can see, it's relatively flat, cleared of growth, and we started to dig our holes for the footings. We're going to use concrete blocks over pads of compacted gravel, and that's what we're going to do next.
I rented a plate compactor to help pack the gravel into a uniform surface and to help prevent settling. A handheld tamper and some elbow grease will also work. I like building sheds atop concrete blocks because they're inexpensive and easy to work with.
At this point, I'm really just eyeballing the site for level and seeing how many blocks I'm going to need in each spot. It looks like this low corner I'm going to need about 3. If you feel like you have to go higher than 3, you should really consider either doing some preliminary leveling work for the whole area or switch over to concrete piers.
To level the blocks, I use the highest corner as a benchmark and then level out from there using a box beam level clamped to a long, straight board. To make subtle adjustments, I add or remove gravel from the pad as needed, again, working my way around the perimeter from the highest point.
Okay, this is looking really good. Now that we got the foundation leveled, we're going to move on to start framing the floor.
Let's look at the shed's floor frame. When you strip away the floorboards, you'll see that each side of the floor frame is made from a pair of pressure-treated 4x4s. The whole perimeter of the frame locks together at the corners, and the floor joists just drop into the notches. Joist hangers and other metal connectors aren't necessary because these joists rest on top of the 4x4 below. Although there are 2 notched 4x4s for the floor frame, the wall assembly consists of matching top and bottom plates. So, for our first set of cuts, we'll gang all 6 members and cut them together. To cut my lengths, I clamp all the pieces together, flush one end, and then trim the other end to length.
Okay, I've got my 4x4s laid out and clamped together, one end flush and the other end cut clean. Now I'm going to work on laying out for my notches. Now, this lumber can tend to be a little bit swollen when it's wet, so I'm going to mark from the center and then work my way out.
To get a good fit, I'm going to mark the width of my notches using an actual 4x4 cutoff with a marked center line. I find the center of my stack of boards, align the marking block, and scribe each side of the cutoff. Then I square up those marks across the width of the stack. I then measure from this center line to find the location of the other notches, and then repeat the marking process. I'm going to get the notches started with a circular saw, setting the depth of cut to half the thickness of the 4x4s. Again, don't assume the 4x4s are a standard 3.5-inch square. If the wood is wet, and it likely will be, it's going to be swollen. Adjust your halfway mark accordingly. Then I make my first 2 passes with the blade, just removing the marked line. I'm comfortable making this cut freehand, but a saw guide or straight piece of lumber can also be clamped to the stack to help you keep on the line. The rest of the passes are just to kerf the lumber so it's easier to remove the waste. Aim for no more than 1/4 inch between kerfs, otherwise it'll be difficult to knock the lumber loose with the claw of your hammer.
Okay, we've got these notches roughly cleared out, and now I'm just going to come back through with a router and actually clean them up and square up the sides. For this, I'm going to use some straight edges on either side. You could use a scrap of 2x4 and screw it down if you don't have clamps, but I just find these faster to work with. Now you can see I'm spacing these off to either side. I measured the base of the router to the edge of the bit, and I'm going to set my fences on either side of the notch to that so that when I use my router I have a boundary that keeps me from going off track. Okay, so that's the router method, but if you don't have a big honking router, you can do this the old-fashioned way with a nice wide chisel. It's going to be a little bit slower, but works just as well.
With my notches complete, I cut my remaining floor joists to length.
Okay, we've got all our floor frame pieces cut. Remember, we're going to set aside the 4 for the top and the bottom plates, and the rest we're going to move over to the footings, and we're going to start assembling our pairs. Okay, so for this project we're using structural screws. They're pretty generic. They're made by a lot of different manufacturers. So we're just going to tie these pairs together and pay attention to the crown of the board before you assemble these. And what that means is sighting down the board and taking advantage of any natural arch. And you want to put that up so that as the weight of the shed compresses the things down, it'll flatten out rather than bow down.
Next, I take diagonal measurements to check that the assembly is square. Ideally, the two measurements should be within 1/8 inch of each other. If not, persuade the frame a bit with a hammer. The framing gets locked together with 2 screws in each corner. Again, check each joist for crown and then fasten each end with a structural screw to pull the whole assembly tight. The floor of the shed is simply a combination of 2x6 and 2x10 framing lumber fastened with galvanized nails. Just like the 4x4 components, these floorboards are likely to be wet from the lumberyard and a bit swollen, so I want to install them tight to each other so that when they dry out and shrink, I'm not left with excessive gaps. For any overhangs, snap a chalk line and use a circular saw to trim the boards flush to the frame.
Okay, that does it for the floor framing. Next we have walls, and this gives us a nice flat surface to work on.